The EU's Energy Performance of Buildings Directive has far-reaching implications for owners, operators and developers of buildings in the UK. The directive itself was inspired by the Kyoto Protocol, which commits the EU to reducing CO2 emissions by 8% by 2010. By 2009, member states will be required to comply with Article 7 relating to energy performance certificates, Article 8 on inspection of boilers, and also Article 9 concerning the inspection of air conditioning systems. In this programme, we look at energy performance certificates, which have been with us as part of the Home Information Pack for nearly a year. Since the 6th of April 2008, they've now been extended to the sale, rent or construction of buildings other than dwellings with a floor area greater than 500 square metres.
And joining us in the studio now to discuss this is Richard McPhail from the National Home Energy Rating Scheme. Very warm welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining us. Now, can we start with a bit of background first of all? Depending on who you believe, I gather that buildings account for roughly 40% of the energy consumed within the EU. 40%.
It's a lot, isn't it?
It's a huge figure and a really shocking one. And I was surprised that it's buildings that are one of the biggest culprits.
Yes, well, I think everyone was, to be honest. I mean, when the EU looked at how it was going to meet its Kyoto responsibilities, we did the sums, and it was surprising across the board that buildings accounted for such a big proportion.
Well, indeed. So in broad terms, what are the directive's requirements then in respect of these energy performance certificates?
The idea is that a certificate is produced at a key moment in the life cycle of the building. So essentially that's when it is first constructed, when it's sold, or if it's rented, when there's a change of tenancy. And that applies for all domestic buildings and all non-domestic buildings.
And of course, as Michael was saying, these have been part of HIPS. You know, we've been living with this for some time now.
That's right. That's right. And it's being phased in. There's a 3-year implementation programme which ends in January 2009, effectively the end of this year.
And of course, it's not just domestic housing we're talking about.
No, it's all buildings.
OK, what part do building regulations play in all of this?
Building regulations mostly govern how you construct a new building. And Part L of the building regulations, that's the conservation of fuel and power, give you the rules by which you have to construct the new building. And nowadays, it's entirely about CO2 emissions.
And what sort of target emission rate are we talking about?
Well, essentially, the way the target works is that the software that you use calculates the emissions rate of the building that you are designing that would have passed the previous set of building regulations, that's 2002, and it reduces it by 20%, so it's 80% of the 2002 regs. And bear in mind that Gordon Brown, in his last budget as Chancellor, called for all new houses to be zero emission by 2016. So there's quite a lot of jumps we've got to make between now and then.
So there'll be a lot of work to be done. Well, let's pause there just for a moment and take a more detailed look at EPCs.
These certificates are for all buildings and will be required whenever a building is constructed, rented or sold. The energy performance certificate is similar to the labels provided with domestic appliances such as refrigerators and washing machines. Its purpose is to record how energy efficient a property is as a building. The certificate will provide a rating of the energy efficiency and carbon emissions of a building from A to G, where A is very efficient and G is very inefficient. EPCs are produced using standard methods with standard assumptions about energy usage, so that the energy efficiency of one building can easily be compared with another building of the same type. And it allows prospective buyers, tenants, owners, occupiers and purchasers to see information on the energy efficiency and carbon emissions from their building, so they can consider energy efficiency and fuel costs as part of their investment. An EPC is always accompanied by a recommendation report that lists measures to improve the energy rating of the building.
So, Richard, what key information does the EPC actually contain?
There are two A to G scales. One of them is the SAP, the Standard Assessment Procedure, which is the government's energy label. The SAP is essentially a cost-based rating. It reflects the cost of the fuel needed to provide heating, hot water and building in the case of domestic buildings in each instance. And the cheaper the cost of the fuel, the higher the SAP rating, the higher up the A to G scale. The second one is the CO2 scale, and that's the CO2 per kilograms of CO2 per square metre of floor area per annum.
So essentially then we've got an energy efficiency rating, we've also got an environmental impact rating as well.
Exactly.
What other key information is in the EPC?
Well, there's information about the breakdown of the running costs, heating, hot water and lighting, and then most importantly for certificates for existing buildings, there's recommendations about how the energy efficiency and the CO2 can be improved.
Oh, so they do give advice?
Lots.
Right.
Six or 7 pages of information, most of which is advice about how to improve the building.
Well, can you tell me a bit more then about that recommendation report? How is it
Yes.
structured?
Recommendations basically break down into 3 types. The first are what we call the sort of headline measures, and they're the ones that go on the front page of the certificate. And those are measures which are always cost effective. It means that they cost less than £500 and take less than 5 years to pay for themselves. And those would be things like loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, draft proofing, hot water tank jacket and low energy light bulbs. Then there's the longer term measures. Those are often the things that come up as opportunities when new people move into the building. So those could be things like floor insulation, flat roof insulation, solid wall insulation, replacing the windows for double glazing. And the third category are the ones which are behavioural measures. It's essentially all about living a low energy lifestyle, you know, not overfilling the kettle and you know, draft proofing the under the door and all the things you can just do yourself that don't cost anything.
Yeah, actually quite simple things. Do they really make much of a difference?
Well, cumulatively they do, yes. They're absolutely part of the whole picture.
But presumably the rating shown on the certificate is only given provided those recommendations are undertaken. Is that right?
You get both.
Okay.
You get as is and as it would be if you've implemented the advice.
Well, so that's what the Energy Performance Certificate is all about. Let's find out now when an assessment is required.
An energy performance certificate is only required when a building is constructed, sold or rented out. An EPC is valid for 10 years, except for the sales of homes, which are subject to the Home Information Pack Regulations 2007. And in these cases, an EPC must be no more than 12 months old when the property is first marketed. When the construction of a new building is completed, the builder is responsible for obtaining the certificate and providing it to the owner. And this is a duty under building regulations. This will also apply if a building is converted into fewer or more units and there are changes to the heating, hot water provision or air conditioning ventilation services. For existing buildings that are to be sold, the building's owner is responsible for ensuring a certificate is made available to all prospective purchasers at the earliest opportunity. When buildings are to be rented out, the landlord is responsible for ensuring a valid certificate is made available to all prospective tenants.
Well, let's look at new buildings first of all. This is the place to start, isn't it, with the builders?
Absolutely.
So a long time coming, I'm sure, as far as you're concerned.
Yep.
Talk us through that process.
It's essentially a 2-stage process. You start with the plans for the proposed building, and at that stage there's a certificate produced which is effectively a temporary certificate. It's called the Provisional Energy Assessment, and what that tells you is what the score, if you like, of this building is going to be if it is built exactly as the plans are laid out. Now, obviously, things happen during the building process. So when the building is completed, in order for the developer builder to get a completion certificate, then there has to be the full EPC produced to essentially check that the building has been built as planned and still complies with the building regulations.
And what incentives are there for the builder?
Well, essentially, it's just part of the building regulations and they have to do it. I think increasingly, and I don't think this has been true for long, but I think increasingly because of a much raised public awareness about all of this, people actually want to buy a house that's more energy efficient. Yes. So I think there are now incentives for builders to go beyond the minimum that the building regs require so that they can actually sell the house at a premium.
Yes, so that buyers are actually driving that demand, aren't they?
I think that's beginning to happen, yes.
Yes, no bad thing in your book, I'm sure.
I'm very pleased about it.
Yes. What about existing buildings that that are due to be sold? What's the process then?
Well, the process is a single process where a domestic energy assessor goes into the building, and a typical building takes them no longer than about an hour to collect the data that they need in order to produce the assessment and thus the certificate. Essentially, there's two parts to the process. The first part is that he or she is collecting a set of data that's designed to answer the question, how fast is this building losing heat? So that's all about the fabric of the building, the walls, the roof, etc., etc. And then the second part is, what are you replacing that lost heat with? What is the fuel? What is the efficiency of the system, the controls, the hot water, etc.? And together, that it builds up in order to produce the results that we've discussed that go on the certificate.
Well, let's move on then to the rented sector, because this is the last area to be drawn into the net, and this is going to affect many people, isn't it? Talk me through that process. When is an EPC going to be needed? Okay,
so essentially, when it's quite analogous to the sold sector. When the property is in effect offered for rent as opposed to for sale, the landlord must organise to produce a certificate. It's exactly the same process as in the sold sector. It uses the reduced data SAP, which is a special version of the government's energy label, the SAP, which is designed for this process. And it's exactly the same, because if you think about it, it has to be, because sometimes buildings, houses particularly, can move from being owner-occupied to being rented and back and forth. So there has to be the same measure.
There has to be some synergy there, clearly. What about the differences between the public and the private rented sector? Are there any?
No, it's exactly the same. Public and private. The only difference really is that for the private rented sector, this is all completely new.
Indeed.
Public rented housing, local authorities and housing association housing have been busily, quietly in the background being improved for the last 20 years because the government has required them to do that. So the people who manage public housing are very used to this whole process. So there's a very small piece of training, upgrading that they need to do to get used to how the RDSAP works as opposed to previous systems they've been using. So for them, it's not going to be very different. But private rented housing, it's going to be all a new process for them.
What about a block of flats?
Well, the government department responsible are very keen for people to use existing data as much as possible, and obviously there's an awful lot of similarities between the individual flats in a block. So there are methods of what we call cloning and sampling that are allowed, so you don't actually physically have to send an assessor into each individual flat and keep reproducing the same thing.
Does that keep the cost down as well?
It does, absolutely.
Well, let's have a look then at the key components of our energy performance assessment in a case study.
Our case study is a domestic Victorian end-of-terrace property constructed in about 1870. The property was built before the requirement for cavity walls, so has solid walls and, alas, it lacks loft insulation. The owner wishes to not only reduce the property's annual fuel bill, but also the carbon footprint of the property.
So first of all, Richard, who can become an assessor?
Well, there are actually two kinds. There's one for new build, and they're called on-construction domestic energy assessors, and there's one for the sold and rented sectors, and they're just domestic energy assessors, and anyone can become one. It rather depends on where you're starting from. I mean, if you are already an experienced building surveyor, you know about heating systems, etc., then obviously the training process is shorter. But essentially, it's an 8-day training process. It's 4 pairs of days spread over about 3 months typically. There's a lot of there's a lot of background reading to be done in order to fill in the gaps in the candidate's knowledge. In parallel with this, each candidate uploads electronically 5 EPCs which are assessed by a specially trained assessor. So it's a very practical aspect of the training. Then there's an external exam to be taken, and then you get your diploma. Then every DEA must be part of an accreditation scheme, of which there are 6 or 7, and we run one of them. And that's the checks and balances within the system, if you like, because the accreditation scheme monitor everybody's work to make sure that everybody's sticking to the conventions and that we're all, as much as possible, singing from the same song sheet.
Yes, indeed. But there have to be those checks and balances in place, don't they? Because otherwise confidence would evaporate.
That's right.
But considering the huge undertaking that this was for the industry, have we got enough assessors trained up?
Most certainly we have. Unfortunately, as we all know, the housing market has collapsed at just around the time that the HIP was introduced. I hasten to add, not because of the introduction of the HIP, which some people would like to claim. So thus, there are plenty of assessors. I mean, I would say probably in some cases there may be, in some areas, there may be too many.
Okay. So how would an assessment be undertaken then?
For an existing house, the assessor visits the house, they measure the footprint of the house, they record the details of the walls, the roof, the windows, and all the details of the heating system. They take site notes, they take photographs, and there's a set of forms to be filled in, and then either on site or later back at home, they enter the data into the special software, and that will produce the results and all the answers and the certificate.
So it's a comprehensive process. How do you think this particular house will be rated?
Well, this is an old house. One of the things you learn quite early on in the system is that walls actually make a huge difference. On the whole, people think that energy efficiency is about the loft and the windows. Actually, the two things that almost make more difference than anything else is the walls and the efficiency of the boiler. So in terms of the walls, you can't escape the fact that a house built before the 30s will almost certainly have solid brick walls, and they just lose heat much faster. And of course, it's a big area. This is an end of terrace house.
So presumably that's what you're specifically looking for. Anything else?
Well, the efficiency of the boiler and the loft insulation. It sounds as though there's not much loft insulation, so that's a big opportunity. And then when the time comes to replace the boiler in this house, the opportunity there is to get one that's probably 10 or more % more efficient than the existing one, and that makes a big difference.
So those two very important. Any other little tips that the homeowner could do?
There'll always be lots of small things to do, like draft proofing doors and windows. I wouldn't recommend replacing windows if they're sound, because that's an expensive thing. You can put secondary glazing on windows, and then of course when the windows have to be replaced because it's time to do that, then the regulations require that they are modern standard double glazed.
Okay, so that property owner has got some work to do, clearly.
Yes.
Well, before we go, let's have a look forward at the timescales for full implementation of the regulations.
In April 2008, EPCs became mandatory on construction of all dwellings. Also, EPCs are now required for the construction, sale or rent of buildings other than dwellings with a floor area over 10,000 square metres. And within 3 months, the figure reduces to buildings with a floor area of over 2,500 square metres. In October, EPCs will be required on the sale or rent of all remaining dwellings and all remaining buildings other than dwellings. And working through to 2011, we'll see air conditioning systems become part of the Energy Performance Certificate.
Gosh, Richard, that's an ambitious timescale, isn't it? Is it a realistic one, do you think?
I think so, yes. I think generally we're pretty well on track to get it all implemented in time now.
Excellent. How do you see things developing then?
Well, I think particularly in terms of housing, of course, if you own your own house, this only impacts you if you sell it. And clearly, with the state of the market as it is, fewer people are going to be selling their houses. So
Yeah,
overall...
But if you're in buy-to-let, you're going to get clobbered, aren't you?
Well, if you're as a landlord, yes, but remember that the certificate for rented houses only has to be produced once every 10 years. It isn't every time the tenancy changes, so it has a long life. Okay. But I think we'll start to see more voluntary use of EPCs for people who are owner-occupiers not thinking of selling, because I think more and more people are interested in reducing their carbon footprint. And it's a cliche, but it begins at home.
Yeah. Where could things be improved, do you think?
Well, I think that for instance, I could foresee a situation, and this is already beginning to happen, where the utilities link up with local authorities. And the local authority will write to people saying, even though you're not thinking of selling your house, we'll organise getting an EPC produced. And then the utilities can help with the implementation of the measures, loft insulation, cavity wall insulation, more efficient boilers, and the local authority could reduce the council tax if people actually act on the recommendations.
What about buildings other than homes, though? Any improvements there?
Well, one of the things that's significant is the fact that any public building, when this is all implemented, will require a display energy certificate. So as a user of a public building, if you go into a building, say in the summer, and it seems to be incredibly cold because the air conditioning's up blasting away, you could actually go and look at the certificate and say to the building manager, it says here this building's supposed to be cooled to 20 degrees, it feels more like 16 in here. So it's all of that sort of naming and shaming thing, if you like, which all goes back to the washing machine scale and the effect that had, and made the manufacturers sit up and take notice, and it was a dramatic effect in a very short space of time.
But Richard, ultimately, the ultimate aim of EPCs was to reduce emissions, wasn't it? CO2
Yep.
emissions. Is it going to be successful?
Over time, absolutely, it will be. Yes, I mean, as we new houses, of course, is new buildings that are a very small proportion. The real challenge is the existing stock, and as we were saying, with the case study, a lot of houses, particularly in our city centres, are solid walled. So there's always a limit to what you can do, but it will raise people's awareness about what can be done, and I think people will start doing it.
Yeah, you must be very excited. At last, it's come to fruition.
It's taken a long time, but I am, yes.
Nearly 30 years, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. Richard, thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome.
And I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Many thanks indeed to Richard for joining us. There's more in the study notes from Richard, so do have a look at those. But from all of us in the studio, until the next time, goodbye.